Okay, we're recording. So as Megan said, my name is Brent Batchelor. I'm a regional program leader, but as I said, we showed poultry, mainly broilers, throughout my kid's career, which started in 2003, and mainly did Houston and the State Fair because we really didn't want to have more than one set of birds at a time, especially when we had two kids showing. My daughter was 3 years behind my son, so we ended up having two sets of chickens for several years there. But anyway, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Oh, somebody asked about roosters and hens, or as they call them at the show, cockerels and pullets. Yeah, we're gonna talk about that during the presentation. So if I don't answer your question, make sure you ask it again. Still got people popping in. So one of the amazing things about chickens, I always used to tease when I was a county agent, tease the beef cattle producers. I was like, man, said I can take a, about 1.5 ounce, 2 ounce chicken, and 43 to 45 days later, I can have him weighing, 9 or 10 pounds. I said, how are you supposed to compete with that? And they would just growl at me, which was fine. It was all in fun, but that's what we're doing, because the genetic potential of these birds it gets more amazing every year as far as what they can take and what they can hold up to. When we first started, the birds were not as fragile as they were, like when I was a kid, but certainly more fragile as far as just things happening to them than they are now. So, your job is to get as much of that genetic potential out of them as you can, and hopefully tonight's presentation will help you do that. So the outline for tonight, we're going to talk about housing and equipment, kind of getting started and what to do, your pre-brood setup. In other words, before the chickens even get there, what do you need to do? We're going to talk about feeds and feeding schedule, and culling and pen selection. So I like to use this little triangle because these are all the things that go into a successful broiler project in this case. You have to have the right environment, which is your house. You have to have the right nutrition, which is your feed program. And you have to be willing to spend the time on the management of the birds during that feeding period. And of course, there's an ever-presence of genetics, which genetics you don't really get to pick like most of the other projects. You're able to pick the project that you want to do, that individual animal or group of animals that you may purchase on your own, whereas the genetics from the poultry end comes in the box. So whatever you get in the box, that's what you have to work with, and you really don't know what happened to them before, between the time they hatched and they got to you. You hope they were taken well care of, but there's some things you need to look at to see if you think that happened, and make sure you're prepared if you need to do something different than what you would normally do. And I know that sounds kind of like Greek, but we're going to cover all that. So the things that you can control is the environment, the nutrition, and the management. Genetics comes in the box. So first thing we're going to talk about is the house. Here's what the house has to do. It needs to you need to be able to control the temperature, control the moisture, and kind of goes without saying, you don't want outside predators, including the ones that you own as pets, to get in there and disrupt your house and start eating chickens. And not only that, you don't want other birds or anything in that house, because they can bring in diseases and things that'll set you back and could possibly make you not even competitive for the show. So think about your house or what you're planning on for your house, And think about these things when you're considering your house. Control the temperature, control the moisture, and eliminate access to outside predators. Sometimes that's harder than you think. So this is an example. This is the type of house we fed in. It's a solid wall ventilated, forced air ventilation house. It'd be real similar to maybe a commercial chicken house. Most of these houses have air conditioning in them, like window units or some type of air conditioning. And they have fans that pull air in and push air out. We'll talk about those in a minute. But these are big commercial fans. You can get them at different places. We used the attic exhaust fans, the little ones that you get at the hardware store. We picked ours up at Sutherland's and we wired them. And so we had one pulling air in, one pulling air out. And that helps, that air exchange helps keep the air fresh in there, eliminates odors and helps keep your litter dry in that. So that's one option. You don't have to go that way, but that is an option. But there was a lot of good chickens fed in a house like this. Now this house, this young lady did pretty well throughout her career at the majors and county shows. But you can see it's just a chicken wire house. She has plastic that they roll up and down to help block the wind or keep it warmer when it's cold. And then they roll it back up when it warms up and give those birds some fresh air. You can see how deep the litter is in that house, and just a typical old-fashioned broiler house that they used. So these are perfectly okay as long as they can do those things that we talked about. It's a little harder to control the moisture in these. Of course, if you get the humidity up, even in an enclosed house, sometimes it's hard to control the moisture. The temperature within reason is pretty easy to control in these, as well as the closed house. You can see that contraption back there is that's actually a swamp cooler that works pretty well till the humidity gets up. So they use that to help cool the house as well as fans. Most houses are set up to run everything off electricity. You can see all the wires and their water hose and all that running around the house there. And sometimes that's a challenge, keeping the power on and that. So particularly when it's cold and you're early in the feeding period and you need to keep them warm. So you might, we had a couple times when we knew the weather was going to be really bad, particularly that first week when the birds needed to be 90 plus degrees, we secured a generator just in case. Never had to use it, but we secured one from a friend just to use to keep the house warm if we ended up needing to do that. So as I said, it's all about being prepared and thinking ahead sometimes as to what comes next. So let's talk about lighting. Lighting is important. My recommendation is 40-watt light bulbs, no more, no less. You can use incandescent or LED lights. We used LED, the single LED lights. We don't recommend fluorescent, although when we first started, we actually used fluorescent. And then one of the commercial guys told me they had done, at A&M was talking about research that they did with fluorescents that indicated they increase the stress level of birds, the commercial birds. So what he said is the chicken's eye could pick up that strobe. Sometimes if a fluorescent light's not working right, it strobes. Well, it strobes like that all the time. It's just the human eye can't tell that it's strobing, but the chicken can. So that adds stress to the system. So we went with 40-watt LED bulbs. They provide a nice light. You want the house to be well lit. You want it to be evenly distributed. We used a set of string lights. There's probably 8 or 9 of them on a string that hung from the ceiling. Show you some examples of that in a minute. But that's what we use to light the house. You don't want any shadows or dark spots because the chickens will find those dark spots and they'll sleep all the time if they can. Not that sleeping's a bad thing for them, but you don't want them to sleep all the time. You want them to be up and eating. And by the way, that chick is going to imprint to you, and they really don't. They have some instincts. You know, they'll know once you teach them how to drink and eat, they'll know what that means. But everything that chicken does from the day you get them to the day they go to show, you have to show them how to do. It's not like they're going to learn it on their own. Now, they may learn from each other sometimes, depending on the situation. But you're the one that has to start everything and make them know what their job is and what they're supposed to do, which for you is to eat, feed, drink water, and grow big. So, but that's our lighting system: 40-watt bulbs, incandescent or LED. Here's a look at what I was talking about, just a string of lights. You can buy those sockets pre-strung, or you can get the sockets and do it yourself. That's what we did. And this is the bulbs we use. I don't know, the LED bulbs are different now, but just a little 40-watt LED bulb in a nice daylight kind of color. You also want to have enough floor space. You know, you're going to start the birds in the area which you're going to grow them, and they're going to live. Now, I did have some growers over time, if it was really cold the first few days, they may have kept the birds in the house in a swimming pool or in the garage or somewhere. By the way, we built our house in our garage, and one of the 4-H leaders asked to come look at it one day, and she came and looked at it, and she goes, "That's not a chicken house, that's an apartment." I was like, well, it is what it is. So, but start the birds if you can all possibly can in the area where they're going to grow and live. Because anytime you change that environment, anytime you make a change at all, the birds pick up on that and they stress about it, and they don't do as well as one that would be unstressed through the whole time. Now you're gonna stress them a little bit no matter what, but you want to keep those stresses down to a minimum. But you don't reduce the floor space as the birds numbers decrease. So we're gonna cull them down to fewer and fewer birds as we move through the feeding period. And inevitably, you're probably going to lose some birds from whatever reason, particularly when you're first starting and you're learning. You may lose, quite a few, or hopefully not too many, but you may lose some. So the floor space is important. And the recommendation is 2 square foot per chick at 1 day of age. So if you're looking at raising 50 chicks, that's 100 square feet. Our house, we've had up to 100 birds in the house we had before. So it was a pretty big house. But we just felt like that's what we wanted to do and to be competitive, and built the house to fit it. Well, we actually built it twice. Well, maybe really 3 times, but we kept improving it over time. So we started off with a house that kind of looked like the young lady's house that I showed with the chicken wire and that. Then we enclosed it, but I didn't insulate it. Then we went back and put a floor in it, a plywood floor with insulation under it, insulation over the top, and insulation in the walls, because we lived 20 miles from the Gulf, and it was definitely humid. So we needed to be able to control that temperature, and to do that, we insulated the house. I always tell people if I had to do it over again, I'd probably buy one of those long portable buildings with the roll-up door on one end and the entry door on the side. and just deck that out and use that for the bird. So, but the culling allows an increase in square footage. So you're probably going to start off with 2 foot per bird, and towards the end, middle of the feeding period, you're going to end up with about 15 square foot per bird. Now, if you calculate it out, it doesn't probably actually add up to that exactly, but that's just kind of what you're shooting for. Is as you decrease numbers, you continue to provide the same amount of floor space. And there's 2 square foot. Those that little red square is 2 square feet. So you can see when the day-old chick gets there, that's plenty of room for them. But if you had, only 2 square feet for this size bird, and there was another one here and another one here and another one there and another one over there, well, then you got some space issues. They're going to start, performance is going to go down if you crowd them. So here's an example of a pen that's probably not going to be big enough. It looked like a good idea, nice little pen, set up in the garage, not a lot of birds, and they look okay, but you can tell, the birds typically, once they get past about 6 or 7 days old, they're actually going to gain like 1/4 pound a day. So they're going to grow really fast, and they're going to outgrow that pen pretty quickly. So maybe they thought they could cull them down, or maybe they thought, well, we're going to move them to another pen or whatever, but we don't recommend that. We recommend you start in the pen that you're going to finish in. And don't put all your feed and everything in there if you can keep from it. Store that outside the pen and just use that floor space for the birds. Here's back to the house like we had. I'll go through some of these things a little bit later, but we'll just go through them again now. You can see we had water piped in. We used the automatic waterers for the majority of the feeding period. This is the first few days. And I just want to point out what some of this stuff is so you'll kind of know. That thing right there is a thermostat. So that thermostat controls the heat lamps and towards the end, it would control the air conditioner. We used those for a while, and then we switched over to a different one. I'll show you the one we ended up using. You can see these are tube feeders without the tubes on them. So our philosophy was, if you needed a tube on there to keep feed in the pan, then you weren't in a pen enough. So we pulled the tube feeders off and the tubes off and just used the pans on chains or ropes. These little flat, they're actually lids. We use those the first week as the birds were just getting started. And we also utilize these 1 gallon drinkers for the first week or so. And anytime we used electrolytes, we did it in these drinkers, or we just mixed it and poured it in the auto drinkers. So people have different philosophies on those. Some people say, well, I want to use these drinkers, or the bigger ones, the 2 gallons, the 1 gallon, 2 gallon, 3 gallons, whatever. And that gives my children more incentive to clean them out. I said, well, that was never a problem for us because we had 4 auto waterers, and twice a day we changed out 2 of them. So we had 2 spare ones that we kept soaked in a 10% bleach solution outside the pen. And so every day at noon and every night we changed out 2 of those. So we constantly had those waterers going in and out of there as we went in and out of the pen. So, but that's up to you. It's whatever you want to do. If you do use the pressurized system, you have to have a regulator, and preferably a good regulator that'll allow you to use those systems, because your normal water pressure is too high for these. These are low pressure systems. Again, I talked about these fans. We had two of them, one pulling air in, one pulling air out. Then you'll find in the notes, we had a third fan that hung up in the corner of the pen and circulated air within the pen. It was just a box fan that hung up in the corner. And we turned that on at day 7, and it ran 24/7 the rest of the time, just stirring up air and keeping things moving when the exhaust fans were not running. I don't see it in this picture. I'll show it later, but the exhaust fans run off what's called a percentage timer. So you can set how many minutes they run each hour, depending on the situation and what you want to do. You'll also see a lot of these pictures have thermometers. You know, a good chicken person never trusts, you know, what the thermometer says. So you got 4 or 5 of them laying around or hanging around. The other thing you'll see in all these pictures is the corners are blocked off. You don't want those birds to have access to the corners because they'll pile up in those corners, and, you know, they'll either pile up and go to sleep, or sometimes, depending on the situation, they'll pile up on each other and suffocate each other. So you want them to stay out in the pen. Here's my goldfish picture to remind me. So how many of y'all have ever had goldfish? Anybody raise goldfish, like one goldfish or whatever? So what happens if you put that goldfish in this bowl like this? He doesn't really get much bigger. You can feed him and he'll get bigger and fatter, but he probably won't get a lot bigger once he reaches a certain size. But you could have taken that same goldfish and put him in a water trough, you know, out by the windmill, and he may get 8-10 inches long, because there's more room and more room for him to grow. Same way with the chickens. You got to have that room for them to grow and expand and not be right on top of each other and stressing each other out. So if you think about that 2 square foot, always think about the goldfish and how much better and bigger they'll grow if they're in a water trough versus a goldfish bowl. All right, we're going to switch over to feed and water equipment. Talked a little bit about that already. You know, your equipment is going to last you the whole time. So buy what you need, you know, take care of it. Sometimes you can buy out somebody that's retiring, or their children are, you know, graduating or whatever. I talked about my college roommate. One of them bought out all our equipment and our fans and air conditioners and everything. So they were pretty much set up to go when they got started. But the minimum recommendation is 25 birds per feeder. So if you're talking about raising 50 birds or 75 birds, that's 3 feeders. Now, we had a lot more than that. We probably had, well, I don't know, you saw part of them hanging there, but we probably had, let's see, it was 3 on each side, that's 6, 1 on each end, that's 8. So we had 8 of those hanging feeders, just the bottoms, and 4 waterers for usually 75 birds. So the rule of thumb per water is 15 birds per water and 25 birds per feeder. But if you can go more than that, the other thing that reminds me of is, remember that those feeders and waterers take up space too. So that's going to take away space from your birds. But you don't want to have too many, but have plenty, at least 25, at least 1 feeder per 25 birds and 1 waterer for every 15 birds, because you want them to have access to that 24/7. Anytime they want to eat or drink, you want them to be able to find it. And then supplemental feeders and waterers for the brood. That was that picture, and it'll be another picture here in a minute, was the flats or the lids that we used early on, as well as those 1-gallon waterers, till they get used to those bigger waterers, because sometimes those big waterers, even when they're almost right on the ground, they're still kind of, the lips kind of high for a day-old chick. So, and of course, clean water. It doesn't really matter if you have well water or city water or whatever. Our birds drank city water, the whole time. just whatever you start with, that's what you stay with, because they'll get used to that water and get used to drinking it, because they don't really know any different, because the first water they're going to have is when you give them water. By the way, chicks have an egg sac that's internal that'll sustain them for actually about 48 hours. So usually they're hatched, and then the next morning they're wing banded and shipped somewhere where you or your egg science teacher or 4-H agent or whatever picks them up and gets them to you. So they have plenty reserves, but you know, sometimes if they're stressed in between there, they will get a little bit stressed, and there's a couple things you need to look for and to do for them to make sure they got a good start. So here's a picture of a lot of different equipment. I used to carry this around with me. I don't have it anymore. Plus, it'd be hard for me to show it to you on Zoom. So you can get these kind of waters. These are like 2 gallons. They have the screw lid. You just have to make sure that that rubber seal in there stays good and you get it good and sealed. Because if not, you'll go in and set it down and the air will come in the top and water will come out the bottom and it'll just run over and make a mess. Of course, these are the hanging pressurized waters. They're not foolproof, but once you get the setup and the pressure right and you get them broke in, they're almost worry-free as far as providing water. That is one of the better regulators that I talked about that goes with this system. And if you buy the waterers from one of the vendors, most time they'll tell you what you need to set up the whole system, and you can just buy it all at once. There's one of those things they call a lid that you use in the brood to feed. That particular one's from Kuhl, Kuhl, and a lot of this information's in the handout, but you can buy those by the dozen and you know, use them that first 7 days or so till you get them adjusted to those 2 feeder bottoms. And of course, the feeders, this is the kind they sell at Tractor Supply. Really, all you need is that bottom. And if you're going to keep the tube on there, you can cut all those fins off, because all that does is get in the way of a chicken trying to get to the feed. These are the Kuhl brands, I think. Really good tube feeders. They hang really well, pretty durable. And you'll notice that everything's red, because chickens are attracted to red. You can write that down, by the way. So during the feeding period, many times my kids would put red sprinkles on the feed, and you know, we had a set of red marbles we'd set around on the feed, but particularly in the middle and towards the end when the birds get lazy and you don't know, you know, if they're even going to make it to the show or not. Well, that's when you have to pull out those little tricks and tricks of the trade. But everything's red for a reason, because they're attracted to red. In fact, if you ever have a chicken that has any blood on it, you'll know what I'm talking about, because they're also cannibalistic. So if you get a bird that when you're opening wing bands and they get a little blood on them, make sure you wipe it off and get it off as much as you can, because those other chickens will see that red and they'll go after that bird, and unintentionally, but they'll eventually, you know, could possibly wound it to the point that it doesn't survive. So being attracted to red can be good and bad. So this is a good example of feeder space. You can see these birds in this house have adequate feeder space. There's feeders everywhere, and the birds can go wherever they want to get them. These birds, not so much. You know, these little trough feeders are fine, especially when you're feeding supplemental feed and that. But by all means, take that top off of there, because that's just a bigger hindrance for those birds to get in there. Another observation for me, you know, this house has really good clean litter. We're going to talk about the type of litter we use in a minute, but or shavings, whatever you want to call it. Where this is, the litter's dirty and, you know, been in there quite a while, so not as good a situation. Probably a lot more ammonia in this house for sure than this one. We talked about the supplemental waters at the beginning. These 1 gallon waters, I like the screw top ones pretty well. But this is a house that's set up before the birds arrive. You can see they have burlap on the floor. And we started off using a brooder ring and a sheet. And by the time, probably about halfway through, once we got our house to where we could control the temperature, we didn't use a brooder ring or a sheet. People said, well, the baby birds will eat the shavings and all that. We just never experienced that because we had them eating feed and drinking water, and they didn't have time to eat shavings. But if you have trouble controlling the temperature, you can use a brooder ring. You could get some cardboard brooder rings, or you can just get the metal flashing from the hardware store and make a ring with that. And then you can control that temperature better with heat lamps down in there. But there's also a drawback to that. If you're not there when the heat gets too hot, the birds don't have anywhere to go. So some give and take and all these things that we talk about. You can see all the thermometers that I mentioned hanging around. So here's a good example of feeder space. You can see these birds are gathered around that tube feeder bottom, and they all have room to eat, as well as these birds, the bigger birds, they're up eating too. The other thing that we found with taking the tubes off is, like, if this chicken would have came up over here on this side to eat, and there was another chicken on this side that saw it, chances are they're going to get up and come eat too. Where if we had that tube on there, they might not ever see that bird eating and not go over there and start eating with them, because they are competitive and they're creatures of habit. Like we got people got knocked off and we're letting them back in. So that's just another example of what you're looking for with the amount of space that you need for your feeders. So to heat the building, we recommend that you use at least 220, for every 25 birds, 225 watt heat lamps, or one 250. Ours was set up with 4 250 watt heat lamps spaced out around the building, and that worked very well for us. We can put about 25 birds under each one to start with, and it was pretty easy to maintain that temperature with our thermostat. And sometimes when it was really cold, we would use what I call milk house heaters. I'll have a picture of them. They have their own thermostat. So you kind of set those before the birds get there, where everything's working together and the temperature is perfect. And then when you put the birds in and start managing them, that's when you start adjusting the temperature by day. We do recommend the red lights. Remember, I talked about the 40 watt bulbs. Same thing. Seems like that came out of the commercial research too, is that light intensity over 40 watts affects the bird's performance. So the red livestock bulbs, they can't see that red band light, but then it provides the warmth that they need without stressing them with the bright white light. Now you'll have people say it doesn't matter. I'm just telling you what we did and what we do and what our people that work with us do. So you want to create a brood temperature for that first whole week. When I talk about brood temperature, that's the temperature on the floor. I think it's in the presentation. It's also in the handout, but brood temperature is measured on the floor of the house, 12 inches from the center of the heat lamp. So that's where you measure the temperature for the first week, is on the floor. After that, after the first week, you measure temperature at the top of the back of the bigger chickens. So your temperature needs to be measured right at the top of the back of the chickens. And by the way, for feeders and waterers, that's our same guideline. We want to keep the feeders. You notice that obviously this feeder's taller than hanging higher than this one. It's because we want to keep those feeders up close to kind of where the wings are. Some people say the top of the back. I don't know that we ever had ours that high, but you want the birds to be able to stand up and eat, not have to bend over. Now, when you get to day 43 and 44 and 45 or whatever, however long your feeding period is, those chickens are maybe hard to get up, depending on the set and the genetics and everything. So you may have to lower those feeders back down and even add some more supplemental feeders to keep them eating. But for the most of the feeding period, you want to raise those feeders and waterers along as the chickens grow. So as I said, that's what we used primarily for heat, was the heat lamps and the electric milk house heater. So we depended a lot on electricity, obviously. This is the thermostat we used. We got ours at Sutherland's or somewhere. It's basically a window unit air conditioner thermostat. But what we did is we took it and connected it to all 4 heat lamps with extension cords, and then laid it on for that first week, we laid it on the ground 12 inches from the center of one of the heat lamps. And you can set that temperature, and it's very accurate. It'll turn off and turn on within about a 2 or 3 degree ratio. So as it cools down 2 or 3 degrees, it'll come on, then you'll warm up, it'll turn off, and it goes back down. Now, this to me is very important to have some kind of thermostat, because particularly in the spring, or even right now, if you weren't able to come home during the day and you had your setup perfect when you left for school in the morning, and it was 55 degrees like it was this morning, well, then what was the temperature, right after lunch? It was probably closer to 80. So if those heat lamps don't have a way to turn off on their own and you can't get home to do it, yeah, you got a problem, because you got a house that's way too hot for little birds or big birds or anything. So thermostats to me are a must. I showed you the coil thermostats. You can get those from Farm Tech. Those work fine too, but we just found this little thing. It was cheap. It worked really well. Then we switched it over to our air conditioner once we started using that, and hung it out into the house. And it controlled the temperature of the air conditioner too. So they work very, very well. Lux Pro little thermostats. I don't know, back in the day, they were about $15. They're probably 115 now. I don't know. But anyway, that's one of your tips there. This is that milk house heater I was talking about. You can get them at Walmart or Tractor Supply. They're fairly simple to operate. We built shelves in the corners of the house and set these on there and used them when the temperature and the wind was blowing and it was hard to keep the temperature constant with the heat lamp. We would use these. They have their own thermostat, so you just set those to coincide with they don't have a number on them, so you don't know if it's 90 or whatever, but you just keep fiddling with it till it's cutting off and on at the same time as the heat lamps. Just another way of keeping them warm. This is also in the handout, and you'll have a copy of this presentation, but this is basically what we're looking at. Week 1, it's 90 degrees at brood temperature, which is flat on the floor, 12 inches from the center of the light. And then we basically are dropping it a degree a day. So after the 7th day, we drop down. So week 2, we're running at about 80 degrees. Week 3 is 75. Week 4 is 70. Week 5 is 68. If you can get it down there, you're probably having to kick on the air conditioner somewhere in there. But you never know. One year when we fed state fair birds came in August, so we didn't really need heat lamps to keep it warm that first week. And then we had to turn the air conditioner on even to get it down to 80 degrees the second week. So you have to be prepared for whatever the weather brings you. But that's one of the advantages. And one of the things that I told you have to do with that house is be able to control the temperature, whatever that takes. And remember that room temperature is measured 6 inches above the kind of the bird level. The top of their back is a good indication of where you need to be measuring that temperature. So your thermostat needs to be able to hang and move up as you need to lower that temperature and control it better. Oh, these are brooders. You can still get these. They have the heat lamps in them. We just use regular hanging heat lamps, 4 of them. These brooders are really nice. You can see they're pretty high up in the air, so they're heating a big area, and they're controlled by this thermostat over here, one of the coil thermostats. Just another picture of that thermostat hanging up in the air after the birds get a little bigger. You can see that unit is almost as high as it can go up in the air. So this is later in the feeding period when it's probably still cold outside, so you need a little supplemental heat, but it doesn't need to be way down on the birds to produce a lot of heat. The birds will tell you if they're comfortable. You can see these birds are well dispersed. They're all either eating or drinking for the most part, and doing really well. They do have these necked down a little bit. You can see those bread trays they put around there to hold them a little closer in under these heat lamps. And they do have the burlap down at this one, but you can see they also have access to the shavings. So this was probably a really cold start, so they kind of necked them down and make sure they stayed under the light, didn't get over in the corner somewhere and get cold. Again, this is very nice, adequate temperature control. You can see the birds are well dispersed. They're comfortable. They're all looking good. A little bit later in the feeding period. These birds are not comfortable. Obviously, there's one little heat lamp, and all the birds can't get under it. They're all huddled up together. They got their heads down. They're not doing you much good as far as eating feed or drinking water when they're like this. So something would have to be done pretty quickly to get these birds to move along and do well. Correct use of the thermometer, we talked about that already, is kind of at the top of the birds or about 6 inches above the birds. And these thermometers, we just keep in there to keep our thermostat honest and to keep ourselves honest. So you want to be able to look at those and just be reassured that the temperature is where it needs to be and that you didn't forget to reset your thermostat or something like that. Because the more information you can gather from the birds and from the environment, the better off you are. This is not a good use of a thermometer. You know, the old feed store thermometer on the wall doesn't tell you anything about what's happening down where the chickens are. So unless you got that hanging from a string out in the middle of your pen, that's probably not going to tell you much information that you need to know. One of the things you'll see sometime, we call it pasty butt or whatever, these birds typically were stressed. Most time we think it's excess heat. They got too hot somewhere in the process, and that might be one of those houses that didn't have a thermostat, and you know, you left in the morning, it got hot during the day, you came back in the evening and it was cool again, and you may have never known that they got too hot. But they'll get this kind of the manure sticks to their butt, and they, you know, it's easy to clean off, and most of them will recover, but they'll never perform quite as well. And you may have one or two that do that just anyway because they're just not as thrifty. But if you have a bunch of them do it, then, you know, somewhere in there they got too hot. So set up your house 1 week prior to hatch, which is basically hatch day is the day that they tell you you're going to get your birds, because ideally they are hatched the night before, they're wing branded, and they get to you before they're 24 hours old. Sometimes they're a little longer, but that's what we start with. So make sure everything's set up a week before, make sure everything's working, that you can find everything, you know, clean out your exercise equipment and get your shavings down, get everything set up, make sure it's working. So you want to turn the heat on, turn the heat lamps on, and whatever other heat source you're going to have 3 days prior to hatch to make sure it's regulated, make sure your thermostat's working right, make sure everything's good, because you don't want to have to worry about that the day your birds get there. You want to, if you can, put your feed and water in there 1 hour prior to the birds getting there, either chicks or poults, whatever you're doing. Here's another tip. You can write it down. It's also in the handout. For the first 7 days, we recommend you keep the water at 80 degrees. Now, that's not boiling water, but the way it was explained to me, which makes sense, if you were a little chick and you've never had water before, and your first drink of water was like cold water that came out of a faucet outside when it was, 30 degrees outside, and your first gulp of water was that cold, it would probably shock you. And you may not want to go back and drink water again. Just like, well, that didn't feel good. So just run the tap water up, just use a meat thermometer or something and get it around 80 degrees and fill those waterers, particularly those supplemental waters, the 1 gallon waters. We just had like one of those square cube 5 gallon jugs that we would fill up in the house and take out there, and it had a spigot on it, and we would fill those waters and just do that for the first week. You'll find they adapt to the water a lot quicker, and they are not shocked when they drink it. And so they're more apt to drink more water and then therefore eat more feed. So another secret sauce tip there. That's what the pre-brood looks like. You can see there's a shot of the air conditioner that we didn't have before. This house has different fans than the first one we looked at, but basically the same setup. And the way ours was set up, like this would have been the fan pulling in air, and there would be another fan on the other end of the house. In our case, it was in the door of the house that was pulling air out. So you get good airflow pulling through the system. Just another shot of the house. There you see both those fans are on one side. And the way they had this set up is they had 2 kids. So when they got ready to divide the birds, or if they had 2 pens at one time, they had a partition that would go through there. So they had fans on both sides to manage air on both sides of the unit. And then the air conditioner was on the end over there. You can see a little bit of it there. See, they had 2 thermostats running in this house. Well, actually, there's another thermostat. So they must have a thermostat for each of these gangs of bulbs. All right, moving on to feed. The other thing that we can control, always recommend Honor, which is a Land O'Lakes Purina product, or Producers. But I would tell you that most of the major show competitive feeders are and have been feeding Producers for quite a while. We fed Honor the first few years and did well, but when we switched over to Producers, it was remarkable what the results were using Producers co-op feed, and it's cheaper too. Of course, it goes without saying you feed continually, freshen the feed daily, change the feed out every 3rd day, which means you dump everything out of that feeder and start over. When you're feeding the crumbles at the beginning, you'll have a lot more residue in the pan in the feeder than once you move over to pellets. And that in our feed program is listed out in the handout. And so we started mixing pellets at day 12, and we were completely on pellets by day 16. So you start with crumbles, 30% turkey starter crumbles. And if they're really dusty, you want to sift them. We had a colander that we sifted everything through until we moved to the pellets, which that saves a lot of work too when you can move to the pellets quicker, because very seldom do you have to sift the pellets. They're pretty stable for the most part. And again, we talked about raising the feed and waterers as the chickens grow. This is just a shot of the Honor show chow. I guess their bags still look like that. I don't know. I hadn't seen any. But let me get rid of a couple of things. Their turkey starter is 30% with 5% fat, and they have a grower which is 26%, 6.5% fat, and they have a finisher pellet, which is 22%, 6% fat. So you can see throughout the growing period, we reduce the protein and increase the carbohydrates or the fat in the diet. Because at first we're trying to grow a skeleton and grow a bird that can handle a lot of meat. So we're trying to get as much growth out of them as we can. But then really nowadays, quicker, we move the carbohydrates up and the protein down because we want to start stacking meat on those birds. And that's just how you get it done, is to stack as much meat on those birds as they can handle, and hope you got the right box of birds. This is the same thing for producers. They have a 30% starter. It comes in a pellet or a crumble. Mainly the pellet, the turkey people switch to quicker, but even the broiler people now switch to that pellet. I said starting at day 12 and then move completely to pellets by day 16. So that's the advantage of producers. Honor does not have a pellet in their starter or their 30%. And then their broiler starter is what they call their broiler starter is a 26%, 6% pellet. And then their finisher is 21%, a little less protein, and 6% fat. So both really good feeds. The advantage we found with producers is we picked it up at Bryan, and I know they have stores, and you could look at the dates on there, and usually it was, sometimes you get it, it'd still be warm because they just bagged it. So super fresh, the birds loved it, and things work really well when the feed's fresh and everything's eating well. So you don't want the bird sitting around, keep your feeders up if you can. You want to encourage that. I love these shots of these big wide birds. Those are obviously good birds. When you can see that much width in their breast, and the amount of meat that can be stacked on these birds is amazing. So where can I find those feeds? So the Honor feeds, most of the Purina dealers have that. The producers comes from Producers Co-op in Bryan. As I said, they have a store in Hillsboro now, Producers does. And some of the local feed stores during the feeding period will handle that for you. They price it up a little bit naturally to get it there and to make a little money on it, or you can pick it up directly from Producers Co-op in Bryan. And we usually would pick up, we had 4 or 5 feeders, so we would take turns going up and picking up a batch of feed. And we wanted to keep the feed fresh, so we never bought more than about a week's worth, what we thought we were going to use in a week, and then we'd go back and get some more. So the wet feed, if you choose to do so, is just rule number 1, keep it simple. Now, if you talk to somebody that fed chickens in the 70s or 80s, the wet feed or the supplemental feed you gave them was important, because back then they wanted the chickens to have yellow pigments in their breast and on their legs. Well, now they don't care about that. They don't care if they're white or what, as long as they're carrying a lot of breast meat. And that's really all that counts is breast meat. The legs and thighs are just there to hold the chicken up. The breast meat is what sells. I'll show you a picture here in a minute. So for those of you that weren't around before chicken tenders, I'll show you some chickens that didn't have chicken tenders, believe that. So you keep it fresh, don't cook it. Don't add any whole grains or cracked corns. Feed for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then you're just feeding it on top of the feed in the feeders. And if your droppings become loose, just stop. But this is not what really wins the show. What we used and what our formula was we would render down some bacon and use the bacon grease and the coconut oil. You don't use any vegetable oil, no milk products. That tends to make the birds go soft, but coconut oil is fine. we'd melt some coconut oil and some bacon grease. Now, caution on bacon grease, a couple of the guys that use my formula stopped using bacon when the major shows went to the wing clipping, because they used to just take a stool sample for a drug test. Then they went to wing clipping, which supposedly measures anything that goes into that bird from day one on, they can find in that wing, or the feathers. It's a feather clipping. They don't clip the wing off, obviously, but so they were worried about commercial hogs being fed ractopamine and it feeding through to the bird. So they quit using bacon. One of them uses organic bacon, but I was like, hey, I'm not paying that. So coconut oil works good, fairly inexpensive. You just mix enough of that, and that formula is in the handout also. One thing that I don't have on the handout or on the PowerPoint is we used eggs. You know, the chicken comes out of an egg. So for the first 7 days, we would chop up boiled eggs and mix in with feed, and do that about 10 times a day for about 7 days. Then we would replace that with the supplement that we're going to recommend here in a minute. Yeah, somebody said they go to Heitemeyer's to get producers, but anyway, it's available. You can either get it at the mill, or there are some local folks that handle it. Just make sure it's fresh. Make sure you have a good relationship with them. There's our Purina dealer. When we used to go to them, you know, occasionally they may have a sack left over from the fall or something, and I'd always make them. We knew how to check the date that it was manufactured, which is on Purina. It's on the strip tag, or the where the little white thing where they sew it together. There's a date on there, and on producers, it's printed right on the feed tag when the date it was produced. So make sure you got fresh stuff. Part of your job. I'm probably going long a little bit. Vitamins and electrolytes and antibiotics. Used to, people wouldn't feed birds at all unless they had a electrolyte routine at the beginning. We really never did, but they have a specific purpose. They're to help the birds hydrate and get vitamins into them if you need to. Antibiotics, man, if you got to use antibiotics, you're probably way behind the 8 ball. That's to treat some kind of respiratory infection, probably because you didn't control the temperature, or something else happened in that house that caused the birds to get sick. But the way we decided whether we fed electrolytes at the beginning, we had them ready to go, but we never put them in the water until we got the birds. If you look at the birds, the shank on the leg, and they're either yellow or white and look fairly hydrated, you just give them water. Now, if they're kind of green looking and dehydrated looking, then you probably want to put some electrolytes in there to kick them off. But we wanted those birds to taste water the first time they tasted it, just like they would that whole time. Now, you know, as a preventative, I just don't think there's any benefit to using electrolytes or anything else at the beginning. We did use electrolytes at the end. Anytime we culled birds, we would give them electrolytes before we culled them, just to keep them hydrated and make sure that we did everything we could to reduce the stress on those birds when we were culling them or working with them and changing out litter or whatever the case may be. That's a little later in the feeding period, not at the very beginning. Citrulite, that was our electrolyte of choice, and still is. Everybody I talk to still uses Citrulite. The antibiotic is LS50. It's a Lincamix type product. I'm not sure you can still get that. We would buy a bottle every other year just to have, and then occasionally, like for county birds, we may have a bunch of birds get sick, and we would share that around because it's only a quarter teaspoon per gallon of water for 3 days is what the LS50 is. The citrulite, you just mix it according to what the package said. So we would mix it up towards the end of the feeding period and keep it handy and use that when we were culling. But sometimes we'd keep a LS50 bottle and never open it, but that was the price we paid for being ready. And that's expensive. Citrulite's a little more expensive than regular electrolytes, but LS50 is really expensive. So physical stimulation. This is what the easiest thing you can do in your management is to provide physical stimulation. The more you do this, the better you're going to do. Several times a day. I can't emphasize that. My wife's here; she can attest to that. I had the nighttime feeding, so when the alarm went off at 2 o'clock in the morning, I got up and went out and stirred chickens. And I can't say I got up every time at 4, but most nights I got up at 4, and that was from day 1 till day 28 when we let them sleep for 2 hours at night after we cull them. But it just takes a lot of time and effort. Then the kids would do the morning routine and get everything, the waters changed out and the feed freshened and stir them then. And I was lucky enough to most days get home at 10 o'clock, check them again, come home, eat a sandwich, check them at noon. I would check them at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then the kids would get home after that and they would take it till they went to sleep, sometimes all the way to midnight. And then I would pick it up again at 2 o'clock in the morning. So every 2 hours was our routine. And we stuck with that as much as we could. I'm not saying we went out there every 2 hours, but most of the time during the feeding period, this is the one thing that you can do that doesn't cost you any money. And it increases your chances of being successful with really any poultry project, but particularly for broilers. Because I always tell people that, you keep a steer for a year maybe and a pig for 4 to 6 months, and you do put a lot of time in and working with those, but really a good broiler feeder will put as many hours in that 6-week period that you have those broilers as, most of the people put into their pig projects or even their steer projects for that matter. But it takes a lot of time. It's just all crammed into a short period of time. So litter management, use the high quality shavings. We used to call them Canadian shavings. Most of them come out of like cabinet maker shops and that use real wood. Dry Nest is another one of them. They come in the big bales. We would buy enough to make it through the whole season. You use a lot less of this than you do those coarser made shavings. Don't recommend those. The ones that Tractor Supply or some of the other ones that might be okay for pigs or something don't really work in the chicken pen. So the key to keeping clean, dry chickens is keeping the ammonia down. Always tell the kids, if you walk in the pen and you smell ammonia, you got a problem. Because if you can smell it where you're standing, imagine what those birds are smelling down there where they're at. You got water in there somewhere. It came from the water or somewhere water got into that house and you have ammonia. Because if the litter's dry, it'll soak up all the moisture out of the droppings, and you can stir it in and it stays good. But if you start smelling ammonia, you need to figure out what's going on and fix that as quick as you can. As I said, ammonia is not your friend. Moisture equals ammonia. Fresh shavings. Now what we would do is at the beginning, when we put down the litter, we would put down cat litter, just regular clay cat litter under where the waterers were. And we'd also put a product called Sweet PDZ, which they use in horse stalls under the water. And then we'd spread a bale of peat moss out anywhere from, maybe an inch deep all across the floor. And then we would put those good quality shavings on top of that, and about 4 inches, 4 to 6 inches of shavings on top of that. So that's how we managed our litter. And if we didn't get really high humidity, we may never had to change out the litter. If we had really humid days and we couldn't keep the moisture out of the pen, we would change out the litter usually about halfway through the feeding period and put in fresh litter. We're also going to cull to remove unthrifty birds, reduce competition of the flock, separate the males from the females if you're showing at a sex show. So if you're county show or you're showing at the major shows, you may want to separate the cockerels from the hens. Certainly reduces your feed expense and creates additional floor space that we talked about at the beginning. So the way we did it at 21 days, we used a scale, a really nice dial scale, and we weighed every bird. We had a little box that fit on there that had the stuff you put in the bottom of a drawer to keep stuff from slipping around. And we would weigh each bird and write down the weight. And we divided them into 3 groups based on weight. So we had the little ones that we knew probably were going to go for sure, the big ones that were probably going to stay, and then the ones in the middle that we probably had to go back through to hit our number. So that's kind of what we were looking at. People always ask me, well, what should they weigh at 21 days? It's different for every set of birds. When we first started doing that, if we had birds weighing 2 3/4 pounds, we were happy. Towards the end, if we didn't have them weighing 3 1/4, we were pretty disappointed. Now, I think from what my guys tell me, that they'll have some 4-pound birds at 21 days, which is pretty amazing how that genetics works for that. And if you're feeding in a sexed show, in other words, you can show either pullets or cockerels, particularly at the majors or Houston. You might want to separate those, but towards the end, we didn't even do that. We just let the hens stay in there, and they did fine. In fact, one of the years we were top 10 in Houston was with a set of hens that were raised with the cockerels. They were tough, so they just got it done. So that's what I got about culling. The second time you cull is at 28 days, where you cull by feel. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But the first cull, you're trying to reduce the birds by half. So if you had 50 birds, you want to get them to 25, but don't really go below 20 with that first cull. Then at 28 days, you're going to look at length of breast, width of breast, depth of body, and taper of the breast muscle. Lots of times this when you need to call in somebody to help you, somebody that's done it before, that understands what you're looking for. It's not a super hard thing to do once you learn how to do it. But at first, sometimes it's a little daunting because you're not sure, what you're doing or what you're feeling for. But here's some birds that are hung upside down. These are old pictures, to tell you the truth. If I had birds that had that short a keel bone nowadays, I would feel like I was in trouble. Now, most of the time, the keel bone goes up past the joint of the legs for the really good birds, the big cockerels, and goes all the way down pretty long. So, but this is probably a pullet, a little bit shorter, more compact kind of bird. So you can see they're measuring the length of the keel. They want to make sure that keel is nice and straight, that it doesn't deviate to the right or the left or dive back towards the backbone. It needs to be nice and perpendicular with the backbone, and as long as you can get it. And there they're checking the width of the back, because it's just like any other project, a lamb, a pig, a steer, or whatever. The more internal capacity that bird has, the better chance it has of producing the meat that you want it to produce. There's just showing depth of body from the side, and you can see this bird is a lot longer. The keel bone's a lot longer, and it's a lot wider compared to that first bird that they were showing. And there's 2 birds that obviously easy to tell. The one on the left is a stronger bird than the one on the right. There's both those birds hung up again. You can see how much wider this one is than this one. And I can tell from the picture how much longer the keel bone is on this one than this one. So just not as much to this bird. So, if you were comparing those two together, this one would be the cull. There's those same two birds. They processed and froze them. So you can see the amount of meat on the bird on the left. And if you eat chicken tenders, that's what this is right here. It lays under the main breast muscle. But you can see this bird really doesn't have chicken tenders. So chicken tenders are a relatively recent phenomenon because of the genetics of the birds. Now we're able to have chicken tenders and serve them. Lots of restaurants make a living off of chicken tenders, but that's just shows you genetic capability of these birds to pack on meat at an early age. So let's talk about supplements. The only supplement we recommend is R&D Top 2 livestock supplement for broilers and turkeys. It's fairly easy to find now. It was one of those top secret, had to meet a guy on the side of the road under a bridge to get it, but a lot of the feed stores handle it now and it's readily available. They make supplements for all the different species, but the broiler and turkey supplement is excellent, and we still recommend it. And most of the guys feeding our program use it, as well as pretty much everybody else. So maybe not as big an edge as you had before when you used it, but you got to have it to stay competitive. We start top dressing at day 7 and use it till the very end. So in other words, we mix it in with that last set of eggs at day 7 and then use it the rest of the time as a top dress. So everything's working well when you're chicken poop. It's only chicken people would look at chicken poop and say, man, that looks good. So that's kind of what we're looking for. You see those shavings are really fine shavings. They're packed in there nice. They're going to absorb all the moisture out of that, and you'll be good to go. This is actually one of the last set of birds we fed. You can see the R&D2 on there. All the birds are going to it. Once they get used to eating it, it's like bird cocaine. They love it. So they go up and start eating that, and then they just keep eating through it and eat feed. So smells good. They love it, and it makes them eat more feed, which is ultimately the goal. There you can see our setup with the 4 heat lamps are still hanging in there. They're probably not on anymore. Now, this go round, we had plastic under there over our floor. That kind of come and went depending on how we were feeling and the weather. But you can see we had the coroplast in the corners to keep them out of the corners. Here's some of that equipment up close. This is a percentage timer. It comes pre-wired. You can wire it yourself, or it can come pre-wired. These are from Farm Tech. That's the thermostat from Farm Tech. That's the little thermostat that we use towards the end. Remember, the percentage timer goes on the fan, and you can turn that dial to make it come on for, maybe 20 seconds every 5 minutes, or maybe a minute every hour. Whatever you want to do, you can set it to do. Just whatever the outside temperature will allow you to do to bring fresh air in. And this is just a timer, a typical plug-in timer. And we use those after day 28. After we called it day 28, we would give them darkness for 2 hours between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning. So I didn't have to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning anymore, because that would turn the lights off. It would turn the radio off. We ran a radio. My daughter would tell you, depending on what kind of music was playing, is how well the chickens did. So the year she won the state fair, they listened to Texas country the whole time. One year, all we could get in was Tejano, and I don't remember how those birds did, but just whatever the radio would pick up. So those are just some up-close looks at the tools, and a lot of that's mentioned in the handout. So birds that look like this and perform like this end up doing really well for you. On the left is my 2 kids. That's state fair. My son won it, and you can see how old my daughter was then, and then this was the year she won it. And you also get to learn the judges and know what they like. Now, most of them are going to like the biggest, meatiest birds you can find that are uniform, but you take what you got and hope for the best. And if you know what the judge is looking for, then that makes you even much better. This is one of my college roommates and his son. They won Houston 2 or 3 years ago now, and then they won San Antonio the next year. So they had it figured out. I'm sure they were doing something extra that I didn't teach them, but I always told them the secret to their formula was this old guy right here, because he lived there where the birds were, and he was in that pen all the time. If I ever went over there, he was in the pen. So I think he just slept in there, which was probably fine with his wife. But that's what it takes, is to be dedicated and to have a formula and stick to it to do well at whatever level you want to play. I know I went a little bit long, but y'all have some questions. I see Megan put the link to the evaluation up. If you're so inclined, if you would click on that, I think she's also going to email that to. That would help us so they can tell this old guy you talked too long or whatever. So what about questions? You can stick them in the chat or open your mic or whatever. And if you need to go, I understand that. But if you want to stick around and ask questions and talk chickens, I'm willing to spend another 15, 20 minutes here. So, and that question about different for raising cockerels versus hens, or roosters versus hens. Really, the program's the same. We believe that you just hit the gas the day one and keep on the gas till the end. The birds hold up and you got the right genetics, you're going to do well. I always say that in every set of birds, every 25 birds, there's probably one bird that's a little bit better, if not superior, from the rest of them. So that's why when the state fair would let us, we would buy 100 birds and, try to cull them down and get them down to the ones we wanted. Like at Houston, that's part of the reason they upped it to 75, because when Houston and Austin was the same set of birds, people just didn't feel like they could get a decent set of cockerels and pullets out of one set of 50. So they let us go to 75. So we would feed 2 sets of 75, one for each kid, and hope we could find 4 birds that were, excellent. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. We made the sale every year at Houston. My son made it every year but one. And I think that year we didn't make it. We probably didn't put in the work that we needed to, and I don't think we had the box of birds. The next year we made the top 10, so it was a good experience for us. And my daughter made the sale everywhere she went except Houston, I think twice. But all right. Thank you. Oh, what happens to the chickens after the show? Well, they've done their duty. So you process them, and if your show requires you to get that to the buyer, then that's what you do. Some shows just give the buyer a certificate, which I never like those to go down to HEB because, there's very few chicken processors around. There's a few around. We used to take them into Houston, and finally we talked one of our 4-H'ers into building, and then one bought a picker, and we would just process all the birds together and sell them. So they become chicken soup and chicken salad and all those other stuff that chickens become. Yes, the question was, did my college roommate's son feed the same program? As far as I know, yeah. No, it's one of those chicken deals. He never tells me everything. He never even tells his best friend, which was my other college roommate, everything. But yeah, that's the basic program that they followed. Yeah, somebody talked about green feed. There used to be a supplement that was green. There was a hydrator. And there's one that is 2 of them that are available now that are green. But color is important to chickens. Greens and reds and things attract them and make them eat more. But the key is just getting more. Whoever stuffs the most feed down them is the winner usually. So if you got the right set of birds and everything works in your favor. About the litter, yeah, we would stir the litter, kind of put on a pair of rubber boots and walk through it, stir it up a little bit if we felt like it was needed. Sometimes the kids would have one of those little manure forks, and they'd go in and pick up the stuff off the top and throw it on the compost pile. It just depends on the individual situation. Sometimes we stirred very little and had really good luck, and other times we had to change out the litter more than once. Oh, talking about the finisher feed or the wet feed, we would start after the last cull at day 28, and we do it like, 2 times a day, the first day, 4 times a day, the second day, we got up to about 6 times a day as long as they were eating it. But again, that's just another excuse for you to go in there and give them something else to look at and to be attracted to. So we kept the R&D in there the whole time, and that was probably as good a top dress as we ever found. But we did do the wet feed, and when they ate it and they did well with it, we kept doing it. If they weren't eating it, we would put it in little piles on the feeders. Come back 20 minutes later, if they hadn't eaten it, we just scrape it off into a bucket and throw it away and try again later. Some sets of birds loved it and they ate it, but that formula's in the handout. But it's mostly feed. The coconut oil, and that's just something to hold it together and make it look a little different, and maybe taste a little different to them. All right. Trying to see if there were some questions earlier. Yeah, Megan said we're going to post this on the YouTube channel for District 8. And you'll get that handout. Go ahead.
Yep. Tomorrow, as soon as I get the recording, I'll get that posted on our YouTube page. And I will send that link as well as the link to the evaluation through an email, if you didn't already get it in the chat box.